All right, I will say, Guten Mayed, such a schos Baruch Hashem, to be able to be mamshich the Simchas Yom Tov into Chol HaMoed with some beautiful Talmud Torah, Maseches Makkos, which has just been delightful, absolutely delightful. There's something exciting, right? When you feel, you have something, it's short, right? It's 23 days, so like, I'm getting to more for just a second, right? And the Mir session, there's something just very exciting about it. When Sanhedrin was a massive undertaking, which was incredible. When they finished it, certainly a tremendous feeling of elation. But then there's these little mesechtalach that are just so sweet and so beautiful, and things often we've seen maybe for some of us in our youth. And Baruch Hashem brings back, I don't know, I guess for some it brings back, it's triggering, right, from their yeshiva days. Others, it's a nice memory, but Baruch Hashem. Anyway, and again, a special welcome. I'm going to try to welcome, we have a lot of new people. There are close to 30 new people who joined the shir for Makkos. I mean, not necessarily the in-person shir, but Baruch Hashem, thank God, people who are now doing the daf, not committed for Shas, just committed for Makkos. Wink, wink. Right? That's always how it starts. But a special welcome to Reb Morty, Baruch Hashem, who is to Justin, Baruch Hashem. And beautiful to have a chevra. We'll recognize a few of the chevra every day. Mir Hashem. All right, well, so with that, let us begin. So begin by thanking all of our sponsors. Special thank you to Reb Ari for making sure that we have Pesach coffee. That doesn't taste like Pesach coffee, by the way. It tastes like all year-round coffee, so tremendous shkoyach, and thank you for that. Thank you to all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, for Tafshin Pei, the Tosim Mishpacha, for dedicating all the Shurman Drashos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Nisan, Haba Alinu Latova, Paul Pollack, in a celebration of the Nisan birthdays of his wife Kathy, his granddaughter Tikva Esther, and the birth of a grandson to Eden Jeremiah Pollack of Indianapolis, Indiana. Anonymous Talmud Torah sponsorship in the schos of Simchas for all of our children, and for Nisan to be the month of Geula Shlema for all of Klal Yisrael. Amen. And Avram and Shane Kelman, in memory of Avram's mother, Sarah Braina Bas Yoshua Heschel Zichrona Livracha. Well, so with that, let us begin. So we have a beautiful daf ahead of us today, and of course, as always, we dedicate our learning in the zechus of all of our hostages. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mir Hashem bring them home b'shalom and b'karov, and Mir Hashem in the zechus of our holy soldiers, may they be successful b'chol ma'aseh yedeim. Also to all of our, because it's going on online, all of our online listeners, it's beautiful. I have to say, I woke up this morning to a whole bunch of pictures of people learning daf in different places that they're away for Yom Tov. Chavrusa Shaf's happening. I don't have permission to share them yet, but I'm going to try to get permission. But it's really beautiful. It's really beautiful and really inspiring, and it's tremendous. I think those of us who've been doing the daf for a while recognize that it's so much more than just learning. It's that it becomes an indispensable part of your day. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter where you're traveling. All right, I'll just say, so I got a picture today from Randy Orshan, Yosef Orshan's wife, of Yosef and Josh Rosenblum. They're in Spain for Yom Tov, and they're going. I thought Jews were kicked out of Spain, but I don't know. It's so I guess we're back. I guess we're back there. Right? So nice again, learning together, and just beautiful, just inspiring. There's no such thing. There's no break. There's no day off. Wherever you are, you figure it out. And that's part of the beauty of the daf. Just very inspiring. I got a number of other pictures as well. Just beautiful to see people learning from our shir, all different places, and continuing the energy. Well, so with that, let us begin. We're up to Mishna on Zayin Amud Aleph 7a, up to Mishna. Mishem Nigmar Dino Ubarach. An interesting case over here. Let's say someone so you have Reuven killed Shimon. Right, and now we're fast forwarding a little bit, right? Because Reuven has been judged by a Beis Din and found guilty. And then what happens? Reuven runs away. He escapes. He escapes before they're able to execute him. Ubalifne also Beis Din. Now let's say again, Reuven's brought back. So Reuven's recaptured, and he's brought back into that Beis Din. He's brought back into that Beis Din. So what happens? In Sosron Dino, we don't retry him. In other words, let's say as much. What does this mean? We don't retry him. That Rashi says over here, Lachso v'lisa v'litein ulai yizakeh. In other words, we don't retry him to see maybe we'll find some way to exonerate him. Now, why does the Mishna need to say this? But remember, going back to our Sanhedrin days, in general with capital cases, what does Beis Din try to do in all capital cases? What do they try to do? exonerate, right? That's really what we try to do. We try not to execute people, and we'll do whatever we can to try to find someone innocent. So I might have thought that if Reuven was sentenced to death, but escaped before the sentence was carried out, that perhaps when he's hauled back in front of the Beis Din, maybe we should retry him. Kamash the Mishna says, no, we don't do that. We don't do that. If he's brought back in front of the Beis Din, we don't go and retry him. Well, again, we'll visit that a little bit more in the Gemara. Kamakom shiyam dushnayim v'yomru me'idim anu b'ishploni shenigmar dinu b'Beis Din shel ploni uploni edav harei harek. Similarly, let's say again, witnesses show up in Beis Din. And witnesses say, we are here to testify that Reuven was tried in front of so-and-so Beis Din. So-and-so and so-and-so were his witnesses, and he was convicted. He was convicted, so Beis Din could execute Reuven based on that testimony. In other words, so this is a Beis Din that didn't hear the case, right? But now this Beis Din is receiving testimony from the witnesses who know that Reuven was tried in front of a particular Beis Din. So-and-so and so-and-so were his witnesses. Therefore, they could execute him based on that. Sanhedrin, no heges ba'aretz u'b'chutz la'aretz. So we'll say, so this is fascinating. So literally translated, the Sanhedrin operates in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael. Now, what does this mean? We'll see the Rambam in just when we get to the end of the sugya. But again, the idea over here is when the Sanhedrin is operating in Eretz Yisrael, it has the ability to implement its rulings outside of Eretz Yisrael as well. There's obviously there's no Sanhedrin outside of Eretz Yisrael. The Sanhedrin only resides in Eretz Yisrael itself. But when the Sanhedrin is operational in Eretz Yisrael, its rulings could be enforced outside of Eretz Yisrael as well. The Gemara says, this is the famous Gemara, Sanhedrin ha'horeges echad b'shavua nikres chovlanis. A Sanhedrin that executes a person once every 7 years is called the destroyer. All right? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, echad l'shivim shana. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, no, even once every 70 years. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, back to that previous motif, Beis Din does not like to execute. And therefore, again, Tanakama says, if a Beis Din kills once every 7 years, that's not good. That's a bad track record for a Beis Din. They're called the destroyer Beis Din. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, even once every 7 years. You will say, by the way, how beautiful is it? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Omer, Harei Anika ben Shivim Shana, the beautiful thing about Kedusha is that when you go ahead and you wrap yourself in Kedusha follows you. We had the Kedusha of the Seder, right? The Kedusha of the Seder. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was there with us at the Seder. Remember again, there's the famous saying, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, I'm like 70 years old, but he wasn't 70 years old. And how incredible is it? After 2 nights, right? Is tonight the 5th Seder? Right? I think tonight's the 5th Seder, right? So after Baruch Hashem, after the Starim, after 3 days of Yom Tov, first day Chalamayid, who shows up? Who shows up when you open the door? Who shows up when you open the daf? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So we'll say that's the whole chap with Kedusha. The more you immerse yourself in it, you envelop yourself in it, it follows you wherever you go. Incredible. So Elazar ben Azariah says, even 170 years, not good. So look at this. Rabbi Tarfon Rabbi Akiva say, Ilu chayinu b'Sanhedrin lo nerag adam me'olam. So this is fascinating. Rabbi Tarfon Rabbi Akiva say, if we sat on a Sanhedrin, no one would ever be executed. We'll see what that means. Rabbi Shimon says, hey, Chevra, that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing, because if no one gets executed, right, if no one is ever executed, no one's ever put to death for murder, then in general, you create a general sense of lawlessness. So obviously, what Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon were trying to say was that, we would find a way to exonerate everyone. What Rabbi Shimon is saying is, while that sounds very beautiful, like Al Rachmanis, that's not good. That's not good. A Beis Din does have to execute, because at the end of the day, there are capital cases. And if a capital punishment is never carried out, then that creates a certain sense of societal lawlessness. Okay, more about that in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, so what says? Remember again, the first part of the Mishnah, right? So what was the first part of the Mishnah? Reuven was convicted of murder, sentenced to death. Then what occurs? Reuven escapes. The Mishnah says if he's brought back in front of the same Beis Din, we don't retry his case. So the Gemara darshans in this, what do you see from here? It's only because he's being brought back where? In front of the same Beis Din. But I can infer from that if he was brought in front of a second Beis Din, a different Beis Din, then maybe we would retry his case. I ha tani seifa kamakum shiam dushnayim v'yomar me'idin anu es ish ploni shenigmar dina babezdin ploni uploni uploni edav harei zeh nerag. So 1 second, but yet if you look at the end of the Mishnah, what does the end of the Mishnah say? That if witnesses show up and witnesses say, we testify about Ruvain, that Ruvain was tried in so-and-so Bezdin, so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so were his witnesses, and he was found guilty, that we execute him, which makes it sound like what? Even if he's brought in front of another Bezdin, we don't retry his case. In other words, what it sounds like, what it seems, we'll see here the contradiction from the first part of the Mishnah, it sounds like the reason why we don't re-examine Ruvain's case is because he's being brought back in front of the same Bezdin. I can infer from that if he were to be brought in front of a different Bezdin, we would relook at his case. But then if you look at this end of the Mishnah seems to indicate that if witnesses show up and say, we testify that Ruvain was found guilty in a different Bezdin, we will execute Ruvain based on that and we will not retry his case. So what's going on over here? Both say, this is beautiful. This is absolutely beautiful. Kan Beretz Yisrael, kan b'chutz la'aretz. Both say two different cases. Overwhelming. One is talking about Eretz Yisrael and one is talking about Chutz la'aretz. What does that mean? This sign here, both say, get ready for this. Rabbi Yehuda ben Dostoi, Omer Mishrum Mishum ben Shetach. Barach mechutza la'aretz la'aretz, ein sosrin es dino. Right? So the Gemara says like this. If a person, Barach me'eretz l'chutz la'aretz. If a person runs away from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz la'aretz, we do not retry his case. In other words, here's the case. Ruvain was convicted of murder, right? Ruvain was convicted of murder. So he was convicted of murder in a Beis Din in Eretz Yisrael. And then what happens? He escapes to Chutz la'aretz. So again, in that case, if witnesses show up in front of the Beis Din in Chutz la'aretz, and they say, we testify that Ruvain was convicted in so-and-so Beis Din, so the Chutz la'aretz Beis Din will not retry his case. However, listen to this. Michutza la'aretz sosrin es dino. But halacha l'maaseh, if we go ahead and he escapes from Chutz la'aretz to Eretz Yisrael, we will retry his case. Why? Mipnei zchusa shel Eretz Yisrael. Because it was out of the schus of Eretz Yisrael. And I will say, first I just want to point out how beautiful it is, right? Before we get, so we'll say, so this is really an incredible idea. So the Gemara says, there are times that we will re-examine a capital case and times when we won't. What's the criteria? If Ruvain was tried and found guilty in Eretz Yisrael and then escapes to Chutz la'aretz, and witnesses come in front of a Beis Din in Chutz la'aretz, and they say, we testify that Ruvain was found guilty in a Beis Din in Eretz Yisrael, this so-and-so Beis Din, so-and-so were his witnesses, Beis Din will carry out the execution. Now, again, we'll discuss when a Beis Din in Chutz la'aretz could execute someone. We'll talk about that. But Lamaisa, they won't retry the case. However, if Ruvain was found guilty in Chutz la'aretz and then escapes to Eretz Yisrael, even if witnesses show up and they say, we testify that Ruvain was convicted of murder and sentenced to death in Chutz la'aretz, we will relook at the case, we'll retry it in Eretz Yisrael. Why? The schus of Eretz Yisrael. The schus of Eretz Yisrael. I will say, such a beautiful and overwhelming Gemara just about literally the Kedusha, the holiness, and the schus. You know, it's interesting. We speak a lot about the holiness of the land. This is different. This is zechusa shel Eretz Yisrael. What does it mean, zechusa shel Eretz Yisrael? Eretz Yisrael makes us better people. Eretz Yisrael makes us better people. So a Yid who comes to Eretz Yisrael is a better person. So therefore, again, Ruvain, the murderer, who escaped from Chutz la'aretz to Eretz Yisrael, we have an obligation now to relook at his case. Why? Because Ruvain of Eretz Yisrael is a different person than Ruvain of Chutz la'aretz. And therefore, again, Ruvain of Eretz Yisrael deserves another look at his case. Conversely, Ruvain of Eretz Yisrael is convicted and goes to Chutz la'aretz, he doesn't get a second chance. That doesn't get a second chance. But Ruvain of Chutz la'aretz, who escapes to Eretz Yisrael, zechusa, is a different man. Because he's a different man, therefore, again, his case has to be re-adjudicated. And I just want to point out how beautiful this is to learn Eretz Yisrael, Gemara Chalamai. You know, I think one of the most difficult things, you know, in Chutz la'aretz, you can have a very beautiful Yom Tiv, right? Yom Tiv is beautiful, Yom Tiv is uplifting, Yom Tiv is magnificent. Where do you feel it a little bit more, the distinction in Chutz la'aretz? Chalamai. Right, Chalamayid. Right, Chalamayid. It's if anyone who's ever been in Eretz Yisrael for Chalamayid is Yantiv. Chalamayid is Yantiv. Right, you feel the Yantiv atmosphere. Chutz la'aretz is a little bit more difficult to recreate the Yantiv feel on Chalamayid. It just is. And how beautiful is it that the Ribono Shel Olam gave us an Eretz Yisrael Gemara on the first day Chalamayid. I mean, for us, it's the first day Chalamayid, it's the second day Chalamayid. Right? But for us, first day Chalamayid, Akash Baruch Hu gave us an Eretz Yisrael Gemara, almost as if to go ahead and just give us a little bit of that Kiddusha, a little bit of that feeling, a little bit of that schus of Eretz Yisrael. Incredible. Sanhedrin Haggis. So remember again, the Mishna says that the rulings of a Sanhedrin, right, or literally translated, Sanhedrin Haggis, right, Sanhedrin Haggis, in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. How do we know this? The Tanna Rabbanan, V'hayu eila lachem luchukas mishpat lidorosechem. Lamandu, this teaches us, Sanhedrin Haggis ba'aretz u'b'chutz La'aretz. Sanhedrin operates both in Eretz Yisrael as well as in Chutz La'aretz. Im kain ma tamlo b'sha'arecha. So if that's the case, that the Sanhedrin operates both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz, so why does the Torah frame it, or why does the Torah say b'sha'arecha, in your gates, which makes it sound like that the Sanhedrin only operates in Eretz Yisrael itself? So what's going on? So isn't this what said? B'sha'arecha ata Moshe batei dinim b'chol plach u'plach u'b'chol ir v'ir. In Eretz Yisrael, we'll say the way it worked is like this. Although you had the Sanhedrin Agadol, the high court that operated in the Lishkas Hagos, the chamber of humans thrown in the Beis Hamikdash, you also had Batei Din in every province and in every city, right? A province is made up of multiple cities. So you'd have like a regional provincial Beis Din, or Sanhedrin, and then you'd have smaller Sanhedrins or smaller Batei Din in each city. That's in Eretz Yisrael. B'chutz la'aretz, ata Moshe b'chol plach u'plach, in Chutz La'aretz, you had provincial Batei Din, but not Batei Din in every single city. So as I said, I just want to point out over here something very interesting. The Rambam points out over here in the following. This is the Rambam. He brings down in Hilchos Sanhedrin, Perek Yudal Aloch. He says, Bizman shedonin dinei nefashas be'eretz Yisrael, donin dinei nefashas b'chutz la'aretz. So this is very interesting. When the Sanhedrin operates in Eretz Yisrael, Sanhedrin is sitting there, and the Sanhedrin adjudicates capital cases in Eretz Yisrael, you can adjudicate capital cases in Chutz La'aretz as well. With the caveat, V'hu shiyu Sanhedrin smuchin ba'aretz, k'mo she'be'eretz Sanhedrin hagas ba'aretz u'b'chutz la'aretz. So what this means is as follows. When there is a proper operational Sanhedrin in Eretz Yisrael that is adjudicating capital cases. Now that requires two things. Number one, smicha, and number two, that the Sanhedrin is situated in the Lishkas Hagazis, in the Beis Hamikdash. If you have those two criteria, then the Sanhedrin is able to adjudicate capital cases. When a Sanhedrin adjudicates capital cases in Eretz Yisrael, it empowers Sanhedrins outside of Eretz Yisrael to adjudicate capital cases as well. That's the takeaway from this. Incredible. Okay, let's go weiter. Now, the last part of the Mishnah was quite intriguing. Remember again, Sanhedrin Hauragas. So we had two different versions of this, right? In the first version, Tanakama said that a Sanhedrin who goes ahead and executes once every 7 years is considered to be a destroyer, right? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, even once every 70 years. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, if we sat on the Sanhedrin, it would never execute anyone. To which the Gemara says, "L'shivim shana nikrei chavlonis, oldima arach arahu." So we'll say, so what does this mean? In other words, let's go with Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah for just a moment. Is Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah saying that once every 70 years is normal? Like in other words, that okay? In other words, is Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah saying, listen, once every 7 years is too much, but once every 70 years that's normal? Or no, even once every 70 years is too much. To which the Gemara says, Teku, okay? Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Akiva, Omrim, Ilu Ayinu. So remember again, this was fascinating, this last exchange. So Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Akiva said, if we sat on a Sanhedrin, it wouldn't execute, we would essentially exonerate everyone. Now remember again, Rabbi Shmuel says that's very nice, but then there would be a proliferation of murderers, right? You'd create a sense of lawlessness. So the Gemara says, so first of all, by the way, how exactly would Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon accomplish this, right? Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon were confident that if they sat on the Sanhedrin, they would exonerate everyone. Okay, how? How exactly would you do that? This is fascinating. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, the Amri Tarvahu. Listen to this. Re'isem treifa, right? Re'isa treifa harag, shalim harag. So listen to this. they would have asked the following question. That's the following question, right? So, did you kill? We'll say, right? So listen to this. It's Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, if they were on the basin, they would say like this. Okay, so witnesses show up. They say, we saw Ruvain kill Shimon. So they would ask, tell me, do you know, was Shimon a healthy person or was he a treifa? Now, what does this mean? Let's say Shimon was let's say Reuben killed Shimon. Now, we're going to do Gemaras like this, right? Let's say Shimon was a treifa. Now, we'll say, what does a treifa mean? Treifa means that he has a condition from which he is imminently going to die. The halacha is, if you kill someone like that, technically speaking, you're not liable to a death penalty. Now, we'll have to define the scope of that just a little bit more. But in other words, what they would have said, so, okay, witnesses, you saw Reuven kill Shimon, tell me, do you know, was Shimon healthy? Was Shimon a treifa? Now, Pashtos, the witnesses won't be able to what? They won't be able to answer that. They can't answer that. So again, if you can't answer that, that seems to be grounds for exoneration, right? Amravashi, imtim salama shalim hava. And even if you want to say, let's say the witnesses say, no, we know that Shimon was totally healthy. How do we know? They both happen to be Shimon's, general practitioners, right? I don't know. Does HIPAA apply after your patient dies? I don't know if it applies, right? But so they go ahead, right? They said, you know what? We're his general practitioners, and he just came for his physical the day before. We gave him a complete bill of health, so we know that he's 100% healthy. I Dilma b'makom sayef nakahava. Did you give him? But maybe where the place where Ruvain went ahead and stabbed Shimon, maybe he had a hole in his heart there. You didn't give him a complete diagnostic, right? You didn't give him an MRI or a CAT scan or whatever else. So maybe he had a hole in his heart that you didn't know about. In other words, maybe he had some other defect, physical defect that you didn't know about. The Gemara says, okay, so that would be in a capital case. So essentially, in a capital case, if you wanted to exonerate, the way you would exonerate would be to say to the witnesses, how do you know with certainty that Reuven, you say you saw Reuven kill Shimon. Fine, so we're not even disputing that. Maybe Shimon was a treifa. Maybe she was a treifa. They'll say, so that would have been grounds for exoneration. Now, the truth is, the counter to that is, the chazaka is that what? People are treifas, right? But again, nevertheless, we're trying to see, the point over here is that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon would have exploited a particular derech of questioning. And essentially, they would have cast doubt on the fact that Reuven shouldn't be liable for killing Shimon if there's a possibility that Shimon essentially was already halachically dead. He was a treif already. Okay, so that works, let's say in cases of murder. What about in case of immorality? Right? Let's say witnesses show up and they say that we saw Reuven commit adultery. Right? We saw Reuven have relations with Shimon's wife. So how would Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon exonerate in that case? So the Gemara says, so they would have said like this. They would have said, witnesses, did you see the actual act of bia? Right? Literally translated, a tube into an applicator. Did you actually see bia? Right? Now both say, you got to be pretty up close and personal, right, to actually see that, right? And so, in other words, what they're saying is, you might have seen a lot of stuff that looks like adultery, but did you see the act itself? Now, b'pashtos, the answer to that 9.9 out of 10 times is going to be no. No. So the Gemara says, v'rabanan hechi daini. So we'll say, so again, that's how they would have exonerated everyone. So in a case of murder, essentially the way they would have exonerated was to say, how do you know that Shimon was a whole and healthy person? Maybe he was a treifa. And in the case of Arayis, they would have said, did you really see the actual act itself? And the answer to that would be no as well. That would have been grounds for exoneration. To which the Gemara says, by the way, that's actually very interesting. Now, again, in the case of murder, so the reason we reject that line of questioning is because, as we said, the chazaka is that a person is not a treifa, unless, of course, you know that they are a treifa. What about the case of erva? In other words, we'll say, is that valid? In other words, maybe we should say, you know what, if you don't see the actual act of bia, maybe you can't convict. So how do we ever convict someone of immorality? But Rabbanan, so we'll say, because again, when you give testimony about adultery or about arayos in general, the Eidim are not obligated to see the act. What are they obligated to see? Right? Circumstantial evidence that indicates to us that Lamaisa, an act of immorality occurred. Again, rarely are Eidim ever going to see an actual act, right, of actual arayos. Well, what are they going to see? They're going to see a man and woman behaving in a certain way that clearly indicates to us that forbidden sexual activity. Could I say, by the way, it's actually good that we're doing this Gemara now. You know, I have to put this out on our Daf Yomi chat and put it out today. There's a beautiful minhag to actually learn Maseches Sota over Sfira, because there are 49 blot. There are 49 blot in Maseches Sota. So the Rebbe had a very beautiful minhag to learn Maseches Sota every day. I know we just started Makkos, but it's still time for Sota. There's always time for a little Sota, right? It doesn't come out right, but you understand what I mean. So it's actually incredible because also that's what Sota is all about, right? Sota is a different kind of case, but Sota are witnesses seeing a man and a woman, right? A woman who's been forewarned about a certain man behaving in a certain way. Now, they don't see Bia. Actually, really, in that case, all they see is seclusion, right? And that's why, again, interesting enough, that triggers a whole different process. But in general, when witnesses are showing up and they're saying Reuven committed adultery with Shimon's wife, so again, we're operating like Shmuel says, that halacha l'maisa, rarely are they ever saying we saw an act of bia. That's not what they're saying. Rather, what they're saying is we saw enough to indicate to us that there was forbidden sexual activity that happened over here. And I will say that's how we paskin. Hadron alach, Kate, and I will say mazel tov. Our first parak in Makkos. Incredible. What a feeling. All right. Weiter. Celebration's over. Good. Elohim Golin. So now, no, I'm going to take a little break, right? We went hard on the first days of Yom Tov, right? Good. Well, wait till tonight. Elohim Golin. So we'll say, so now we're going to focus a little bit on actually a sugya that is probably the most well-known sugya in Maseches Makkos, which is the halachas of ir miklat, of going to Galus. So remember again, just a little bit of brief background. Upright, Reuven kills Shimon accidentally. We're going to define exactly what all of these terms mean. Reuven kills Shimon accidentally. The halacha is that Reuven is sent to Galus, to an ir miklat, to a city of refuge. A lot of details of that city of refuge. All of those details, Maseches Makkos. That's what we're going to be dealing with. So here we go. So now we're going to focus on what kind of case actually results in a I'm going to use the word carefully. It's not clear if it's obligation, punishment, or opportunity for galus, right? We'll just say right now, what kind of act results in the obligation for the killer to go to galus? These are the following people who are sent into galus. Hahorig nefesh bishkaga, right? Reuven kills Shimon by accident. So we'll say, what types of accidents result in galus? Hayamagil b'magila. So listen to this. So we'll say, magil magila is interesting. They used to have plastered roofs, right? So how would you plaster your roof? You take plaster, and what do? You roll it, right? You roll the plaster. So Reuven is taking his roller, and he's rolling out the plaster. V'nafla ala b'hargaso, and he drops the roller. Again, we'll discuss the parameters. He drops the roller. The roller falls on Shimon and kills Shimon. Okay, accidental. Or what happens? Reuven was lowering a barrel, right? And what happens? The benafla ala b'hargaso, and he lost hold of the rope, right? Or the rope snapped. Something happened. The barrel fell down on Shimon and killed Shimon. Hayayore besulam. Reuven was coming down on a ladder. The nafal, if he slipped off the rung or the rung broke, he falls on Shimon. B'haragaso, in all of these cases, hare ze gola. In all of these cases, ultimately, again, Reuven is sent to Gola. So, like common denominator in all of these cases, Reuven is killing with a downward motion, right? The case of the roller, Rabbi, just so you should know that we're talking about is, he's rolling down, he's rolling out, right? He's rolling down, and the roller slips out of his hand, going in the downward motion, falls down. He's lowering the barrel. The rope snaps, or something happens, the barrel falls down. He's coming down on the ladder, falls down on Shimon and goes. All these cases, Reuven is killing Shimon with a downward motion. This is where Reuven is going to be subject to galus. Aval, let's say Reuven was going at a plastering the roof, but he was pulling the roller up, right, in upward motion, and then lost grip of the roller, right, and killed Shimon. Or or he was hoisting up the barrel, right, and something happened, the rope snapped and the barrel fell down. Or or Reuven was going up the ladder, and ultimately again, and he fell down on Shimon. The boss, in all of these cases, Reuven is not sent to Galus. Why not? Why not? Because in these cases, death occurred through an upward motion. So we'll say, now we don't understand why there is this decision. We'll see this in the Gemara, but clearly the Gemara is outlining a principle for me. Zeh klal, Mishna, zeh klal, kol shebederech yiridaso, gola, v'shelo bederech yiridaso, eino gola. So we'll say, here's the general klal. Anytime Reuven kills Shimon because of some type of downward motion activity, ultimately again, he's gola. He goes to galus. Anytime ultimately again, it's not b'derech yirida, so it's not downward, but rather again, it's an upward motion. He doesn't go to galus. Now, we'll say again, this is a technicality. I just also will say it's a very beautiful line. If you think about this line, kol shebederech yiridaso. We'll say what happens? What happens if halacha l'maisa, a person is experiencing a yerida in life? Experiencing yerida, things aren't going well. Things aren't going well, right? My life is not going in the direction I want it to go, right? I'm b'derech yiridaso. What should you do? Gola. What does gola mean? Change your circumstances. You know, a lot of times in life when we're not in a good spot, what we tend to do is like wallow in it. We just wallow, we just stay there. Meanwhile, the Mishna says, if you're b'derech yiridaso, which happens to all of us in life, gola. Change your circumstances. Now again, maybe you can't change all of your circumstances, but there are always circumstances that are within our sphere of influence. So you're not in a good spot in life. You're b'derech yiridaso, gola. Change your spot, change your place, change whatever circumstances you can, and turn your situation, or at least begin to change your situation around. Incredible. All right, says the Gemara. So I'll say, so where do I know this from? Where do I know this from, right? In other words, so the Mishnah is giving me this klal that if Reuven kills Shimon with a downward motion, so Reuven is sent to Galus, but yet again, if he kills Shimon with an upward motion, he is not sent to Galus. So the Gemara says, where do I know this from? To Amar Kra, Vayipal, so the Pasuk says, Vayapel alav vayamos. So I'll say it's actually pretty explicit. The lashon of the pasuk is vayapel alav, right? When the Torah describes the accidental killer, right? The pasuk in its entirety is obechol even asher yamos ba below raos vayapel alav vayamos v'hula oyevlo v'lo mevakesh raso. So the Torah speaks about again the accidental killer. The lashon it uses is vayapel alav. He falls on him. He falls on him. So what do you see from here? That halacha l'maisa, the din of galus is only visited upon someone who kills someone else in a downward motion. So both say it's not a logic thing, it's a pasuk thing. It's a drasha. It's a drasha. Tana Abanan. So we'll say, so now we're going to unpack this entire sugya. So we'll say, so if, by the way, if you have a newer Gemara, you could see, by the way, you notice on your margins you have the psukim. So if you just take a look at the psukim that we're talking about over here. This is the psukim of Ir Miklat. So it's Ve'krisem lachem arim miklat. You will designate for yourself, I'm just reading the psukim now, not the Gemara. You will designate for yourself cities of refuge. Tina lachem v'gam shama rotzeach make nefesh b'shkaga. Yisrael lager v'zoshav b'sochachem tiena sheish arim ha'ela lemiklat lanos shama kol make nefesh b'shkaga. So ultimately, again, who goes? Who goes to the Ir Miklat? Someone who kills accidentally. So b'shkaga. What does it mean b'shkaga? Prat lemezid. This comes to exclude someone who kills intentionally. In other words, we'll talk about this, that the Ir Miklat, the cities of refuge, were set up for people who killed accidentally, not for people who killed intentionally. In fact, again, if you were an intentional killer, right, Reuven intentionally kills Shimon and decides to run to an Ir Miklat, what do? We get him out. We pull him out. We're going to talk about this. We put him out, and we send him to stand trial in Beis Din. So bivli das, Reuven killed Shimon without intent. Prat lemiskaven. This excludes someone who killed, right, Reuven who killed Shimon with intention. The Gemara says that's obvious. The Gemara says prat lemiskaven. So the Gemara says mezid pshita bar ktalahu. Now obviously, if there's intention, then he's a mezid. If he's a mezid, then he's liable to a death penalty. Ella amarava ema pratla omer mutter. This is very interesting, I will say. So what does it come to exclude? It comes to exclude someone who says Omer Mutter. Now what's Omer Mutter? So it's a fascinating case where Reuven killed Shimon. But when we go ahead and we say to Reuven, what's going on? Reuven says, I thought it was Mutter. Shimon said, this is what happens when you don't pay attention in Shir. Right? I thought it was Mutter. Now obviously we're talking about a legitimate case where Reuven actually thought that what he did was mutter. Now, interestingly enough, what the Gemara is saying is like this. Even though Reuven will not be executed, right? In a case where someone thinks that what he did was mutter, we won't execute him under those circumstances, but at the same time, what? At the same time, he doesn't go to Galus. Right? He's not sent into exile. You don't get your miklat in the case of Omer Mutter. Omer Abaye, Omer Mutter, Anasub. One second. If he thinks that it's Mutter, isn't that extenuating circumstance? Isn't that an ones? Amrle Shani Omer, HaOmer Mutter, Karov Lemezidu. Now I hold that Omer Mutter, so when Reuven kills Shimon, and Reuven says, yes, I did it, but I thought it was Mutter, that's what we call Karov Lemezid. So I'll say, in other words, it's not Shogeg, right? Why isn't it Shogeg? Why isn't it accidental? Why? Because there was intentionality. It's not mazid because he didn't have in mind to do something wrong. He thought it was mutter. So I'll say, so Omer mutter on one hand isn't shogeg, it's karov lemazid, right? It's close to mazid, but not mazid itself. So he won't execute him, but at the same time, he also doesn't go to galus. So bivli das, without intention, prat lemiskaven. This excludes someone like kavana. That's obvious. Gemara says miskavein pshita bar katalu. Obviously, I will say if Reuven killed Shimon, Reuven had intention to kill Shimon, then ultimately again he's liable to a death penalty. To which the Gemara says no. What's the case? Prat lemiskavein laragis abahema v'haragis adam. Interesting. What about Reuven? Right. So we'll say watch this. Reuven had intention to kill. He was hunting. Had intention to kill a deer, but instead he killed Shimon or Lukusi, Vargas Yisrael. Or he had intention to kill a Kusi, which again, not good, but also not liable to death penalty, right? And he ends up killing a Yisrael. The Neifel, Vaharag ben Kayama. He had intention to kill a Neifel, right? A non-viable child, but instead he killed a regular person. So we'll say, so in all of these cases, interestingly enough, you don't go to Gullus, right? Why don't you go to Gullus? Why not? Because it wasn't fully accidental, right? There was intentionality for an act of bloodshed. Just, it was supposed to be, quote unquote, a permitted act. It turned out to be a prohibited act. So again, because there wasn't some level of intentionality, you can't go to, you're not going to be executed for that, but you also can't go to Galus because there was some level of intentionality. Ten Rabbanon, in Bepesa, right? If it happens suddenly, Prat Lekeren Zabis. This excludes the case of a corner. Now, what's the case of a corner? It's actually very interesting. Imagine the following scenario. Reuven is walking with a knife, an outstretched knife, right? Why? I don't know. Like his mother always told him, don't run with scissors, right? He's having some mother issues, right? So he's decided, my act of rebellion, I'm walking around with outstretched scissors, right? That's what he's doing, right? So the Maisa says, now again, he's just walking like that. What happens? He comes around the corner, Shimon comes around the corner, and he ends up killing Shimon. Now again, he didn't have intention to kill Shimon, right? He was just holding an outstretched knife. That's what was happening. So again, I will say, so Lamaisa, in this case over here, he's not going to go to Gullus, right? Why won't he go to Gullus? Because at the end of the day, there was some level of intentionality. You can't say that this was totally accidental. On the other hand, of course, he's not going to be executed because he didn't have intention to kill Shimon. Below Eva, without animosity, prat lisone. This comes to exclude ultimately again an enemy. So we'll talk about this more. That lamaisa again, if there's some pre-existing beef, between ultimately again Reuven and Shimon, we'll see what to do with that. But Reuven will not go to Gullus. Hadafo shedachvo begufo o hishlich alav. Ultimately, this is talking about a case where either Reuven killed Shimon by pushing him, right, by pushing his body against him, or that Reuven was thrown upon Shimon and killed him like that. We'll talk more about that as well. Lahavi Yerida, so the Gemara says, Oh Hishtech Alav, Lahavi Yerida, Shitzorech Aliyah. This comes to exclude a case, or we'll talk about this in just a moment, of going down, Yerida, for the purpose of going up. Below Tzediyah, without intention, or I should say, below Tzediyah means without intention to kill, Prat Lemiskaven. That comes to exclude a case. We'll say, imagine for a moment Reuven threw a rock, right? His intention was to throw it to the left, but it went to the right and it ended up killing Shimon. So we'll say, so what you begin to see, let's finish up. He did not have intention. It comes to exclude a case where he had intention to throw for 2 amas, and instead it went for 4 amas. So we'll say, what you begin to see is a theme. What's the theme over here? When does Reuven go to Gullus? Essentially, when it was really a total accident, right? He did not have in mind at all. What you begin to see is any situation where Reuven had some level of intentionality. Even if it was intentionality to kill an animal, but he killed a person. To throw a rock 2 amas and it went 4 amas, right? He rounded the corner, didn't realize what was on the other corner. If there's some level of intentionality, that of course does not rise to the level of intentionality to make him chayiv misa, but it will preclude him from going to galus. Galus is only, right, exiles, ir miklat, is only for someone who is a full and complete shogeg. If there's any level, even a little bit of some level of intentionality, no galus. This will say these are the details that we're going to continue to kind of flesh out as we go forward. Let's just do a little bit more, then we'll stop. So the Gemara says bayar. So ultimately, again, now it's interesting. The way that the Torah phrases this is, where is all of this happening? In the forest. So we'll say, so it's interesting, right? The paradigmatic case of accidental death is where Reuven is going ahead and chopping wood in the forest, and what happens? So again, we'll see somehow he ends up killing Shimon, whether it's because the axe head flies off, or because a splinter of wood flies off. But the paradigmatic case is where it's happening in a forest. So the Gemara says, why forest? Why forest? So the Gemara says, Ma ya'ar rishus l'nizak u'lamazik likanei sham, afkol rishus l'nizak u'lamazik likanei sham. Because a forest is a place where both parties have the right to be there. So therefore, Allah said, just as the forest, again, both Reuven and Shimon are permitted to be there, so too, again, the only time where there's a chi of galus is where both parties have a right to be there. You know, for example, if Shimon comes into Reuven's property uninvited, something happens to Shimon, so Reuven is not necessarily liable for that, right? Or conversely, if Reuven goes onto Shimon's property, also that's not fully accidental. In order for it to be an accidental death, a number of factors have to be in place. Number one, we've established zero intentionality, right? And number two, it has to be an area where both parties are permitted to be. Next. So both say, so now this is an interesting case here. We'll say, watch this. Let's say Reuven is going up on a ladder. And what happens? The rung buckles underneath him, and therefore, again, he falls down onto Shimon. Now, the Gemara says, Mahu, what is the halacha in this case? Now, what's unique about this case? On one hand, which direction is Reuven going? Up. But yet, how does he exert his force? Down. So the shaila is, so now let's say Reuven falls down on Shimon. So what is this? So what do we see from the Mishnah? If Reuven kills Shimon with an upward motion, no galus. Downward motion, there is galus. So what do you do in a case like this, where on one hand, his intention is to go up, right? He's going up the ladder, but it's a downward motion that caused the breakage of the rung that caused him to come down onto Shimon. So what are you doing? Because it was, right, the paradigmatic case of the ladder where he would go to galus as well. What's the paradigmatic case? Reuven is coming down the ladder, he slips off, and he falls down Shimon. In this case, he's going up, so it's aliyah, but at the same time, it was a downward force that broke the rung that caused him to fall down. So is that called aliyah or yerida? So the Gemara says, Ma'u. So the Gemara says, Ma'u, ki gavna aliyahi. Is this called ascension? Is this called aliyah? And therefore, Reuven will not go to galus, or yeridahi, or is this called going down? And therefore, Reuven will go to galus. Amalei, kvar nagata b'yerida shehi l'tzarech aliyah. So again, it says, okay, we've touched on this already. This is the case of yerida l'tzarech aliyah. So this is the case of going down for the purpose of going up. Rashi says over kvar nagata, hari nagata kan b'yerida shehi l'tzarech aliyah, v'harabina le'el l'chiyuva. So Shabbos says, Gemara suggests over here, we've spoken about this before, and you're chayiv for this kind of case. Since the breakage of the rung happens with downward force, this is called yerida, this is called descent, this is called going down, and therefore halacha l'maisa, you'd be chayiv. Now, whether that's the halacha l'maisa, we'll have to see. That's what the Gemara wants to suggest right now. Now, we're not finished. The Gemara says, Zeh haklal, this is the rule. Kol shebederech yiridasa gola, shelo bederech yirasa in a gola. So the Mishna said, what was the rule? Anytime that you kill someone in a downward motion, goes to galus. Not in a downward motion, doesn't go to galus. So the Gemara said, bederech yiridasa la asuye mai. So when we say going down, what does this come to include? Lav la asuye ki agavna. Doesn't it come to include this case of, again, where I'm going up the ladder. Reuben's going up the ladder, but again, it's the pressure exerted downward that causes the rung to break. And we see ultimately again that he's chayiv. To which the Gemara says, "Lo, my love lasui kai gavna ulatamech kol shebederech yiridaso lasuye mai." What does kol shebederech yiridaso come to include? The Gemara says, "My el lasuye katzav." It comes to include the butcher. And we'll say, what's the butcher case? So the pashtus, the case of the butcher sounds like where the butcher is what do you call it? Chopping meat, thank you. And what happens? He comes down with the knife, and let's say as he's coming down, the knife slips out of his hand and kills Shimon. To be chayiv for that. So the Gemara says, "How can I be lasuye katzav?" Disanya, both saying that's very interesting. Disanya, katzav shem katzev. Listen to this. If a butcher was cutting meat, listen to this. Tanachada, so we'll say there are essentially 4 different brises over here. Tanachada, one brise says, "Lefan of chayiv la'achar of pater." If he kills in front of him, he's chayiv. In back of him, he's pater. Tanya idach, bless you. Tanya idach la'achar of chayiv lefan of pater. Another brisa. If he kills in back of him, he's chayiv. In front of him, he's pater. Tanya idach, bein lefana bein la'achar of chayiv. Whether he kills in front of him or in back of him, he's chayiv. The Tanya idach, bein lefana bein la'achar of pater. And another brisa says whether he kills in front of him or in back of him, he's pater. What is this? The lo kasha. This is not a contradiction. It's very simple. Kan bi yerida shalafana va'aliyah shala'acharav. So we'll say one brisa is talking about a case. Now again, I'll say for the butcher, there's 2 motions, right? Right. When he chops meat, what is he doing? First he goes up and then he comes down. So again, kan bi yerida shalafana. So when the brisa says that he's chayiv in front of him, that's talking about where he kills in the downward motion of the knife in front of him. Va'aliyah shala'acharav. And versus when he's pulling the knife in back of him, right? In the upward motion in back of him. His second brisa is talking about a case of where the aliyah is in front of him and the yerida is in back of him. Both, right? The third brisa is talking about again where the yerida is in front and in back. So we'll say, so it's really actually very simple. In the butcher cases, when is the butcher going to be chayiv galus? When he kills with the downward motion of the knife, but if he kills with the upward motion of the knife, wherever that upward motion is taking place, ultimately, again, he's going to be potter. Incredible. So let me continue. So we'll say, so again, but we're still focused on our case over here. Reuven's going up the ladder, right? And when he presses down on the rung breaks and he falls down on Shimon. So that is what we call aliyah or yerida l'tzorech aliyah. There is downward motion, but the downward motion is for the purpose of going up. So in halacha, how do we look at that? Is that called ascent or is that called descent? And remember again, the nafkamina is big, right? The nafkamina is big. Why? Because if it's ascent aliyah, he's not chayiv galus. If it's yerida descent, he is chayiv galus. So which one is it? To which one says, lema ketanai. You both say the last short line, lema ketanai. Haya ol b'sulam v'nishvatash liva mitachtov. If Reuven was going up the ladder, and ultimately again the rung broke as he was going ahead and ascending the ladder. So tani chada chayiv, v'tanya idach pater. One brisa says he's chayiv, one brisa says he's pater. So Maila b'hakam, are they not arguing about the following case? The mar savar yeridahi, or mar savar aliyahi. So this is machlokas. Again, I will say, it's a great case. What is this? Is this called aliyah or yerida? Is it ascent or descent? Lo. The chuli alma aliyah. The Gemara says, no, not true. Everyone agrees, I will say that in this case, this is called aliyah. This is called going up. It's going up. I will say, by the way, if you think about it, it has to be that way, right? Why? Because if it's not that way, then what? There's never a case of ascent, right? In other words, by definition, every ascent requires pressure downward. If you're going to say that any ascent, right, that ultimately, again, what we call yerida l'tzorech aliyah, or aliyah, yerida l'tzorech aliyah, essentially when Reuven goes up the ladder and he breaks the rung because he's pressing downward, if that is called descent, then l'maisa, there's no case of ascent. The only way to ascend, by definition, is to exert pressure downwards. So the Gemara says it has to be that that's called the case of aliyah, and therefore, again, if Reuven were to go ahead and go up the ladder, break the rung as he was ascending the ladder, fall down on Shimon and kill him, he would not go to galus. That's called aliyah, not yerida. It has to be that way. But lo kashas, what do you do with the 2 brises? The Gemara says, kan l'nizakin, kan l'galus. When the brisa says that he's chayiv, chayiv doesn't mean galus. What does chayiv mean? Damages. I was about to say, let's say Reuben's going up the ladder, right? He breaks the rung as he's going up. He falls down on Shimon. He doesn't kill him. He injures him. What's the halacha? He's chayiv damages. They both said, it's an accident. It's an accident, right? Damages. Nezikin 101 is Adam Olam. A person is always liable for any damages he does. Accidentally, intentionally, doesn't make a difference. You're chayiv for anything. The other brayso that says that he's pater, that's talking about for galus. The other possibility is hava hala galus. Both are talking about galus. V'lo kashya had isli had lo isli. So also it's very interesting. The other possibility is talking about as follows: that alocha l'maisa, one is talking about a worm-eaten ladder. So let's say the rung is eaten by worms, which means that it's rotted. So say in that case where it's rotted. So that Rabbi will say, if then Shimon were to go ahead and step on it, were to break, that would be called Yerida. That would be called descent. Why? Because since we're talking about a ladder that's not really capable of going ahead and holding his weight and sustaining this ascent, that's considered to be descent, and therefore it would be chayiv in that kind of case. Interesting. Look at Rashi just a moment. Had the isli chayiv shekol shliva shesliya kishadarsan ala nechpevasi. It's understood whenever you have a rotten rung, what's going to happen? It's going to sag. It's going to sag. Therefore, by definition, that is called descent. So, nichpeves hi lamata v'yiridahi v'imlo hisliya ein kan yirida. Incredible. Or the other positive, lo kash, the Gemara says, both be talking about cases of ladders that are not eaten by worms. V'lo kasha had mehadik. One is talking about a case where the rung was properly fastened in place, and one is where it wasn't properly fastened in place. Meaning what? If it was properly fastened in place, that's a proper ladder. And therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, if the rung breaks as Reuben is ascending, that's called ascent, and ultimately, again, he's not chayiv galus. If it wasn't properly fastened in place, then that's going to be called descent, and Reuben will be chayiv. So Rabbi will say, it sounds like what the Gemara is saying is like this, that halacha l'maisa, if Reuben is going up the ladder, in a regular case, assuming that the ladder is a proper ladder, right? It's not rotted, right? It's properly affixed. Reuben is going up the ladder, and now what happens? As he's going up, he snaps the rung. Even though, why is the rung being snapped? Why is it snapping? Because of the downward pressure, but we don't look at that as descent. Rather, again, we only view that ultimately, again, as ascent, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, Reuben would not go to galus in that situation. Abba say, how's the Rambam paskin? Now listen to this. So the Rambam says in Hilchos Rotzeach, Perek Vav Haloch Yidal, here it is. Ketzad, Haya Ole Basulam. Here it is. Haya Ole Basulam, V'nishmata Shliva Mitachas Raglav, V'nafla Ve'emisa. Reuben's going up the ladder, and what happens? As he's going up, the rung snaps under him, and as it snaps, he falls down on Shimon and kills Shimon. What's the halacha? Pater min hagalus. Ultimately, again, Reuben is pater from galus. Now, why Rabbi say? Because again, the Gemara paskins that Yerida litzorech aliyah is called aliyah. Yerida tzorech aliyah is called that. Ultimately, again, downward motion for the sake of going up is called upward, right? Aliyah litzorech Yerida. No, it's Yerida litzorech aliyah, right? Because again, what you're doing is you're pushing down for the purpose of going up, right? So Yerida litzorech aliyah, exerting downward pressure for the purpose of going up, is not called Yerida, it's called aliyah. And therefore, again, by definition, when Reuben is ascending, now again, remember, if it's a rotted ladder, right, or if it's a what's the word? Like a poorly constructed ladder, again, then that's a different kind of case. But assuming that it's a proper ladder, right, even though, again, when Reuben's going up, he is exerting downward pressure, that is called ascension, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, Reuben would not be chayiv galus in that case. And Abosai, the Musar Haskell is screaming at us in the daf, that what do you see from here? Yerida litzorech aliyah is called aliyah. I will say, a lot of times in life, it would be wonderful to think that life is like this perpetual journey upwards. It's not like that. You ever have one of those experiences where, things are going so great spiritually, and then something happens, and like you are a little like thrown into this valley, right? And it's so frustrating and so upsetting, and a person feels like all of my work, everything I did to build myself up, is now gone. because of look at this descent, look at what happened. So what's the most beautiful thing in Yiddishkeit is when we descend, right? When we have a yerida, when we have a spiritual descent, it offers us an incredible opportunity to learn so much about ourselves, to learn so much about our weaknesses, right? When I make a mistake, I will say, right? When I get myself into a bad spot in life, that teaches me, right? That shows me like my spiritual Achilles heel. If I use those moments of yerida to learn about myself, to learn about my weaknesses, and to build back better, then it turns out that yerida is litzorech aliyah. Those descents, those spiritual descents, fuel my ascent. And I'm about to say, what's the halacha with the yerida litzorech aliyah? If your spiritual descent, you utilize it to build yourself back better to ascend, then a yerida litzorech aliyah is considered to be an aliyah. And I'm about to say that it turns out that even the descents in life ultimately again are judged as an ascent. Even the yeridos are considered to be an aliyah if the yeridos are used ultimately again for our spiritual betterment. Rabbi say this is one of the most beautiful things in Yiddishkeit. When we fail, our avodah is not to wallow in it. When we fail, our avodah is to ask ourselves, why did I fail? What happened over here? What can I learn about myself? What can I learn about my life? How through my weaknesses can I grow to become a better person? If in those moments of failure, I learn about myself, I build myself up even stronger, then the failure itself, then the yerida itself becomes the yerida itself becomes an aliyah. The yerida itself becomes a moment ultimately again of spiritual ascension. If my yeridos are just yeridos, I don't do anything with it, then just yeridos. But if the yeridos, if the mistakes in life become the opportunity to learn about myself, to build myself back even stronger, then even the yerida is an aliyah. Then it ultimately again becomes a yerida litzorech aliyah. And the halacha l'maisa, the hashkafa l'maisa, is that yerida litzorech aliyah is called an aliyah, a descent for the sake of ascending. Even the descent is part of the physical and the spiritual ascent. Rabosai, shkoyach. All right, good night, everyone. Yeah.